The room still held that paused breath of years, a slight hush, as if the dust itself remembered. Once this place had movement, uniforms, flashes, the careful lifting of prints and fibers, and that silent event beneath them. Now it was only floorboards, mild dusk pressing against the blinds, and the returning footstep of the investigator who had once stood here and believed he understood everything. The wall paint, dulled into gray, reflected the smallest traces of time. He inhaled, letting the air rest in his lungs, not fully, just enough to register its quiet. The atmosphere felt like it had waited for him. Her name had been Circe Delano, age 32, an archivist at the Detroit Public Records Annex, known for her calm composure and perfection with documents. Her colleagues remembered her as someone who handled old manuscripts like living memory, person by person, date by date. She had preferred silence, ink, cataloging order. He had read that line in her personnel file a dozen times, but standing again in her apartment, it felt less like a descriptor and more like a mood that still hovered. Circe, a name uncommon, deliberate, chosen by parents fascinated with Greek myths, according to a small note found in a childhood form. She moved through life with measured focus, no large circles of friends, no open conflicts, no visible edges. He walked past the hallway to the living space, careful not to disturb anything, though nothing remained to disturb. Every mark had been lifted, every fiber bagged, yet the scene persisted in his memory. The smell then had been faint linen and printer paper, something clean. Now it was a mix of old plaster and city air. The window lock still bore a thin line of scratched paint where a previous officer had checked for tampering. The quiet felt exact. He paused near the coffee table where a stack of catalog cards had once been perfectly aligned. That detail had never left him. Even at home, she organized, sorted, defined. He opened his case folder, the sound of paper against paper, and looked at the photograph that had always unsettled him. Not because it was graphic, but because it was orderly. Circe still composed even in that final pose. No clear struggle, no scattered belongings. It was as if she had been reading and then simply paused. The investigators had reconstructed the timeline. She had returned home at 6:40 p.m., according to her building intercom record. The neighbor reported hearing a soft tap of heels in the hallway. Nothing unusual. A light piano record had been playing from her stereo, calm, mid-tempo. He set the photograph down, not out of discomfort, but out of a need to reassign the objects around him. Too long he had treated them as solved. Too long he had believed the conclusion. No forced entry, case closed in administrative archive. A phrase typed neatly in the final report. Even the typeface in those dossiers had felt clean, decisive, which in retrospect made him uneasy. He approached the bookshelf. It was still there, though most volumes had been removed for evidence scanning and cataloging. One shelf still held a slim monograph, Fingerprint Standards 1979 revision. It looked undisturbed, its spine straight. He had seen it before but never considered it more than professional reference. This time he pulled it out gently. Dust rose in the beam of light filtering through the blinds, a soft shimmer. He flipped to the marked page. She had underlined a line in pencil. In common spaces, the fingerprint unseen is often the single most crucial. Underneath, in delicate looping handwriting, she had written, "Nothing is accidental." He paused, letting that settle. The handwriting was precise, elegant, no hurried strokes. He remembered bagging this volume years ago, thinking it was merely a tool of her job. Now it felt like she had been leaving a note to whoever returned, not dramatic, not cryptic, just direct. The memory of that first night replayed, his rookie certainty, his belief that every case had shape. He had taken the standard prints, lifted surfaces, filed everything according to protocol. They had identified nothing foreign in the apartment. Only Circe's prints and the occasional smudge from maintenance personnel, all accounted for. Even the glass she had set on the counter bore only her own prints, smooth, consistent. He leaned near the window now, listening. The city outside moved on, engines, a faint horn, life passing the building without knowledge of this sealed scene. That, he knew, was the true passage of time, not fading memory but unmarked continuation. He opened the second folder, statements, colleague interviews, all polite, neutral, almost admiring of her diligence. One note stood out, not the content, but the hesitation in the handwriting of the officer who had transcribed it. The archivist supervisor had said she sometimes kept duplicates. When asked of what, he had responded, files, records, items we believed checked out to departments. She occasionally made silent copies for internal continuity. That had been the phrase, internal continuity. At the time, he believed it meant nothing more than her passion for order. He sat at the edge of the sofa, the springs creaking lightly beneath him. He imagined her last evening, catalog cards in tidy stacks, pencil sharpened to a precise point, the stereo playing. Not a troubled night, not a rushed night. A night smooth and routine. So smooth it felt planned not by another but by her, as if she had arranged a final act with symmetry. The photograph in his lap caught the low light, her hand resting near the armchair, fingers straightened rather than curled. He had always assumed that posture was incidental, a still moment. Now it troubled him gently, not with dread, but with a realization that detail had gone uninterpreted. Her fingers had been just inches from the edge of the coffee table where the catalog cards had once rested. Her nails were unbroken, her palms showed no tension. That calm unsettled him more than any chaos ever could. He opened the final envelope, print lift sheets. Near the table's underside, one partial, long dismissed as her own. He had carried that assumption without question. The lift labels documented it. Print fragment, incomplete, pattern indicates probable match to resident. Probable, not certain. He pulled the magnifier from the kit, lowered himself closer to the sheet. The fragment swirls came into focus. They were delicate, loops meeting arches. Her academy file prints floated in his memory. Circe had distinctive ulnar loops, consistent across all her registered fingers. Yet this fragment was slightly different, an arch that curved too tightly. Subtle, yes, barely notable, but enough to shift the angle. He had missed it then. Everyone had. He placed the print sheet beside her training attendance record. She had worked in the annex, processing not only city archives, but occasionally interdepartmental evidence transfers, ensuring chain of custody order. She had handled fingerprint revisions, textual clarifications, authentication stamps for prints dating back decades. The file now seemed less like biography and more like context. The stereo, untouched, sat near the bookshelf. He imagined once again the piano notes that had filled the space. He could almost hear the record needle settling, that gentle crackle before melody. A room marked not by intrusion, but by intention. He stood, walked back to the door, then turned once more. The light changed in the room, not brighter, just altered by the shift of afternoon. The dust moved again, thin gold specks. He carried the lift sheet to the window, letting natural light do what lab fluorescence had perhaps overpowered. The arch line of the print caught the light. Yes, it was different. Circe had lived alone. Her door had shown no tampering. Her life had shown no disruption. Yet the fingerprint fragment that everyone had believed was hers was not hers. The case file had closed too smoothly. The line she had written in the fingerprint text returned to him, looping in quiet insistence. Nothing is accidental. He stepped back, heart steady but aware, not of shock, not of any dramatic turn, but of connection, slow, logical, devastating in its simplicity. Circe Delano had worked with records. Circe Delano had duplicated selected files. Circe Delano had written reminders in margins. Circe Delano had left a fingerprint book open to a marked page. Her final evening had not been rushed. It had been arranged, calm, ordered, reflective of someone who understood how investigators observe. He placed the sheet down, smoothing its edges. The dust settled again, the moment resealing. He felt no triumph, no bright revelation, only that mechanical motion of justice moving one careful inch. Yet beneath it, something human stirred, a quiet awareness that she had left a pathway, not dramatic, just deliberate. The room remained still. The investigator closed his folder and exhaled slowly, understanding at last that the fingerprint everyone had missed was not a trace of an intruder, but a trace of her final silent message. Nothing accidental. Nothing overlooked. Only time waiting. He did not leave the apartment immediately. He stood in the doorway, the edge of the hall molding under his palm, the quiet pressing in like a mild, steady weight. Years had passed since the file had been stamped and archived. Still, the air carried a shape of her presence, a quiet geometry of objects and intention. He let the stillness settle, not forcing thought, not chasing meaning, just absorbing what remained. Circe Delano had never been described as anxious, unstable, or frantic. Her records painted her as constant, measured. Even her apartment, now nearly empty, reflected that exact profile. No excessive decor, no scattered sentiment, only tidy rows of books, straight drawers, and a workstation with a single desk lamp. He walked toward it again, his shoes silent, and let his fingertips hover above the switch. Dust layered the metal in such thin uniformity that even pressing it would feel like crossing a line. He refrained. He looked instead at the drawer beneath the desk. It had been examined, emptied, logged, yet something about it remained in his memory, the sound when it opened, the slight resistance as if something thin caught against wood grain. He pulled it gently now. It slid open, smooth this time, cleared of content. Inside, only the lined base paper remained, faintly yellowed. His eyes traced the grain, the paper, the corners that might once have held meticulously clipped documents. Nothing. Still, his mind lingered on the phrase he had once overlooked. She sometimes kept duplicates. That had been delivered with no tone of suspicion, merely an observation of habit, duplicates. The word repeated in his thoughts with unhurried packing. Records, files, names, perhaps fingerprints. She had been a guardian of information. Not possessive, only thorough. He stepped back and allowed the apartment's shadows to breathe around him. The blinds cut the light into angled strips, laying thin lines across the floor. He imagined her in that same lighting, pencil in hand, catalog card angled just so, her shoulders relaxed, her thoughts composed. Nothing in her posture in those photos had suggested panic or struggle. Everything had felt like a continuation rather than an interruption. He approached the kitchen counter. The glass she had used remained sealed elsewhere in evidence storage, but he remembered its placement. Left side, aligned with the counter edge by exact centimeters. Not careless, not mid-motion. Deliberate. Even the stereo remote had been parallel to the table edge. That detail stayed with him like a quiet pulse. The new awareness did not arrive like revelation or storm. It arrived like slow dawn, light growing, shape forming, no sound. He reached for the intercom record in the file. Circe had buzzed herself in at 6:40 p.m. No other entry, no package delivery, no return of a colleague. She had ended her day with the same singular precision that defined her work. He sat once more, his body weight easing into the sofa, letting gravity do its work. The case notes in his lap rustled faintly, paper against fabric. The first interview had been with a junior archivist. Her words on record. Circe believed nothing should vanish from history, not even small notes. At the time, he had interpreted it as professional dedication. Now he sensed a deeper layer, not dramatic, simply consistent with someone who believed information had continuity beyond linear timelines. He reopened the fingerprint lift sheet. Each ridge on the fragment felt suddenly personal, as if she had left it with awareness. But it was not her pattern. That contradiction echoed through him in calm repetition. To leave a fingerprint book open, to underline text, to write, "Nothing is accidental," and yet leave a print that was not her own near her catalog cards, that was either an unseen intrusion or an intentional misdirection. Circe Delano did not misdirect. The piano record again filled his memory. He could almost hear the melody returning, a soft arpeggio settling into the room. He imagined the moment when it ended, perhaps needle lifting, perhaps silence becoming her final companion. He closed the folder gently. Every investigator knows most cases do not resolve with dramatic clarity. Most simply end, papers filed, evidence sealed, time drifting. Yet this one did not sit quietly in archive. It had waited like dust motes waiting to be disturbed by returning light. He rose, walked to the hallway mirror. It was streak-free, unmarked, perfectly centered above a small console table. In the corner of the mirror, a faint imprint of adhesive residue remained. Once, perhaps, there had been a note, a reminder, a pinned card. Nothing now. He remembered the day he first entered this apartment years earlier. Young, methodical, certain. He had lifted every surface without hesitation, following training to the letter. He had believed what was visible, cataloging without question. Only experience, the long stretch of time, and the quiet persistence of certain cases teach that visibility is not clarity. He looked at the lift sheet once more. The fingerprint was too smooth, too tight in its arch to belong to Circe. She had ulnar loops, recorded multiple times. This was not an oversight. It was either foreign presence or controlled placement. He turned toward the main door. Before leaving, he inspected the lock again, the faint scratch line already documented and dismissed. No forced entry, no strange prints, no sign of a second presence. Yet there was a second print. The implication did not rush him. He let it settle, the logic building in clean increments. If she had kept duplicates, records, files, perhaps fingerprints, then she held knowledge of patterns beyond typical catalog staff. She had known precisely what investigators look for and precisely what they dismiss. He stepped into the hall, closing the apartment behind him with a soft, conclusive click. The corridor smelled faintly of old varnish and radiator warmth. He moved toward the stairwell instead of the elevator, letting each step mark a return not to certainty, but to reconsideration. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused. The building manager's office remained where it had always been, a door with flacking paint and a brass knob. He knocked lightly. A moment later, the manager, older now, thinner, appeared. Back again. The voice held no surprise, only recognition of unresolved return. He nodded once. The manager stepped aside, no questions. Records are where they always were. He walked inside. The office held a different scent, ledger paper, heating coil, mild coffee. Years ago, he had skimmed the tenant files, found nothing unusual. Now, he opened the same drawer with a slower hand. Circe Delano, apartment 3B. Move-in date, March 1979. Emergency contact, blank. Employment verification, listed. Visitor log, minimal. He scanned the pages, each line a stable loop of uniform ink. Then he paused. A name logged twice in late 1980, maintenance visit, vent inspection. He checked the signature, A. Mercer, a common name barely notable. Yet the fingerprint fragment, the tight arch, perhaps not hers, not maintenance, but someone who knew how to avoid trace except where it mattered. He leaned back, spine straight, a quiet breath escaping not in relief, but in recognition. Circe had not left a clue for chaos. She had left order for reconsideration. He closed the file carefully, returned it without shift, and thanked the manager with a polite nod. No dialogue beyond necessity. That felt right in the moment's precision. Outside, Detroit's early evening deepened, amber street lamps flickering to life. He walked toward his car, folder under arm. The fingerprint lift sheet rested inside, no longer dismissed, no longer assumed. Nothing accidental. The phrase did not ring like warning or riddle. It settled like fact. Back at his office, he placed the sheet under low desk light. The arch pattern sat in calm defiance of prior conclusion. He began cross-comparison, page by page, not hurried. Names, records, maintenance logs, archivist movement lists, chain of custody transfers, all methodical. Hours passed in near silence, only paper rustle and pen tap breaking the stillness. Then, a pause. A. Mercer, not only a maintenance entry, but also listed on one annex chain of custody form the same month Circe underlined that fingerprint sentence. Not bold, not hidden. Recorded but unconnected. He leaned back, eyes steady. It was not revelation, only alignment. Circe had known patterns. She had known preservation. She had known how investigators think and how history records. She had left the fragment not as a cry, not as a mystery, but as structure, a final act of internal continuity. The lamp warmed the print sheet. He shut off the light. He did not feel closure. He did not feel solved. Only that familiar mechanical motion of justice inching but never embracing. Yet somewhere beneath the documentation and procedure, a thin thread of human presence persisted, as quiet as dust in fatting daylight. He sat with it, not moving, allowing the stillness to speak in its unhurried, silent way. He returned to the apartment one last time, not as investigator, not as analyst, but as someone acknowledging an unfinished line of thought. The hallway was colder tonight, winter air pressing lightly against old plaster. The stairwell light flickered once before holding steady. When he reached the third floor, he paused before unlocking the door, letting the memory of that first entry long ago overlap with the present. Not nostalgia, simply continuity. Inside, the room absorbed him again without emotion. The blinds whispered slightly against their fixtures from a draft, though the windows were closed. The space no longer felt like crime scene or archive. It felt like a record, an unmoving index of a life arranged with purpose. He crossed to the bookshelf and returned the Fingerprint Standards volume to its place with careful alignment. The action felt like restoring symmetry rather than handling evidence. The page with her pencil note lay in memory now, not on paper. He sat in the armchair where she had last rested. The fabric had lost color over time but retained its form. He placed both hands on the armrests lightly, matching her recorded posture. No reenactment, just silent witness. From this vantage, he saw the angle of the coffee table precisely, the one he had stood over as a younger detective believing he understood finality. Now the table simply existed, no burden to prove, no case to close, just wood grain and clean lines. He took out the lift sheet again and held it at chest level. The fragment, arch-tight and unmistakably non-matching, revealed nothing theatrical, only difference. He turned his gaze toward the window, its faint reflection meeting his own. The fingerprint existed not as intruder's trace, not as threat, but as presence, someone who stepped quietly through her final chapter and left almost nothing. Almost. The maintenance log had been brief, signed twice, unremarkably. Yet that fragment aligned with its date, the silent visits, the unspoken access. Circe had not resisted, had not recorded alarm. A vent inspection, a building routine. No reason to suspect, no cause to report. But she, more than most, understood patterns and residues. If she recognized the visitor, if she sensed something, she left no visible sign. He studied the lift sheet without urgency. The arch lines intersected in clean, intentional ways. The smallness of the detail had been the devastation, not because it implied danger, but because it revealed oversight. A single print, lightly pressed, neither hidden nor displayed. A brief presence whose purpose would remain in the quiet category of unfiled. He looked around the apartment again, not searching, simply acknowledging. The stereo, the pencils, the binder tabs she once labeled by decade and archive class. She had loved order without possessing it. Her calm dedication to continuity made sense now, not in dramatic narrative, but in the still way certain people exist, keeping history intact simply because it deserves intactness. He stood and walked to the desk. He pulled the drawer fully, not hopping for hidden notes, only to mark the motion that began all of this re-entry. The lined base paper, clean, uncreased, sat with quiet patience. He removed it, checking edges. Beneath it, wood, nothing concealed, no coded message, only space where documents once rested. He replaced the paper, closed the drawer without sound. The evening deepened. Outside, the faint hum of city traffic continued without recognition of anything within these walls. He set the lift sheet on the desk, beside the stack of archived notes brought out of retirement by his return. The sheet looked at home there, not as mystery or revelation, but simply as one more fact in a room shaped by facts. He walked toward the door, paused in the frame, turning once more to hold the space in still panorama. The dust, the shelves, the measured emptiness, all preserved a kind of dignity. Circe had not vanished into files or conclusions. She remained in arrangement, in absence of panic, in the logical trace of someone who understood that endings are rarely neat and almost never loud. In that moment, he understood the twist not as shock or tear, but as adjustment, the quiet correction of one assumption, that her last night had been solitary. It had not. That did not transform it into confrontation, merely encounter. A presence she trusted, or at least did not resist. A presence that left only one partial touch. He locked the apartment gently and descended the stairs. Each step felt proportionate, neither heavy nor light. The building manager nodded from a distance, and he returned the gesture with equal reserve. Back in his office, he filed the lift sheet again, but not in the closed archive. Instead, in an open drawer, the place for ongoing observation rather than forgotten resolution. The classification would not change any outcome. It simply acknowledged what was true. The case had never been about shock or sealed danger. It had been about precision and the humility of missing something small. He sat at his desk, listening to the mild hum of fluorescent light overhead. No revelation moved through him now, only acceptance. An investigator is not meant to impose meaning, only to witness what remains after time has reduced urgency. He wrote a final note in the case margin, print non-matching, revisit only for continuity, not closure. He closed the folder slowly. Outside, a siren wailed faintly, then disappeared, absorbed by distance. The world continued in its mechanical pace, indifferent to the still work of a single room in Detroit, 1981. He leaned back in his chair, letting the quiet settle over him with familiar weight. He did not chase what A. Mercer meant or what Circe may have sensed. Some truths sit without arc, without explanation, held only by their exactness. Nothing accidental. He whispered it once, not aloud, just enough for memory to register. The phrase no longer felt like a clue. It felt like her last archival principle. He turned off the desk lamp. The room fell into a soft dusk, edges dissolving. Justice remained procedural, steady, unsentimental. Yet in the dim silence, something gently human persisted. Not hope, not regret, just the enduring presence of a life catalogued with care, and the fingerprint that remained not to accuse, not to reveal, but simply to remind. That even in stillness, nothing is ever entirely gone.